They never forgave her for marrying a black man. But after her death, a single envelope turned their judgment into shame and revealed the truth they tried to bury. The midday sun hovered gently above the rolling hills of Rosewood Cemetery, casting golden light across a field of polished stones and whispering trees. A light breeze stirred the flower petals laid atop a fresh mound of earth. Beneath the newly engraved marble rested Eleanor May Whitmore, Ellie to her friends, mom to one and to the rest. A mystery that left them speechless. Her family stood there in silence, dressed in tailored black, their postures stiff, their eyes darting not to her name, but to the name below it. David Whitmore. The man buried in that very plot. Her husband. A black man. A man they had never welcomed. A man they never thought she'd have the audacity to spend eternity beside. "No one told me she planned this," muttered her sister, Margaret, her voice tight with disapproval. Her gloved hand clutched a crumpled tissue, though her cheeks remained dry. She could have been buried in the family vault, her cousin James said, shaking his head, with her own people. But she had chosen otherwise. In her final will, delivered in crisp legal language and signed with a steady hand, Ellie had requested to be laid beside her husband, not the family who called their love a disgrace, not the lineage that considered her years of happiness a deviation. The headstone was simple, yet profound. Etched in clean script it read, "Eleanor May Whitmore, beloved wife of David, no regrets, just love." A quiet murmur swept through the small crowd gathered for her memorial. The pastor's prayer faded as eyes scanned the message again, unsure if they'd read it right. Some turned away in discomfort, others whispered. But none could ignore the defiant grace buried right beneath their feet. A young woman near the back, a caregiver, maybe a neighbor, stood with hands clasped. Her eyes brimmed with something not seen among the blood relatives. Admiration. Ellie's niece Claire leaned toward her mother. "Why would she do this?" she asked softly, incredulously. Margaret's lips thinned, because she never listened. Because she always thought she knew better. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Ellie hadn't just known better. She had lived better. In her own quiet way, she had resisted the pressures to conform. She had made her choice long ago, in the face of condemnation, silence at family dinners, and side-eyed glances at holidays. And now, even in death, she was still choosing. From the front row, an elderly man in a charcoal suit slowly removed his hat and placed it over his chest. His voice broke through the still air, low and steady. "She loved him," he said, and he loved her right back. All heads turned, no one recognized him. But something about the way he stood there, unmoved by their stares, suggested he knew more than any of them ever did. The family would later learn his name. But for now, they only knew the sting of being left behind. Not by accident, but by design. Ellie had made her final statement, not with anger, not with words, but with placement, with stone, with silence, and it spoke louder than anything she'd ever said in life. They stood around the grave like strangers at a reunion no one wanted to attend. The sun was warm, but the air between Ellie's family members felt brittle. Their eyes rarely met. A few shifted their weight uncomfortably on the grass, glancing down at the fresh headstone that now bore Ellie's name, right beside David's. "She really did it," one cousin whispered, a tremor in her voice that tried to pass as disbelief but cracked under the weight of guilt. They had all tried to pretend he was a chapter she would one day forget, but she never did. Ellie met David when she was 23, after wandering into a quiet little bookstore tucked between a jazz cafe and a barber shop. He was reading Baldwin by the window. Their first conversation had been about books. Their second was about the looks they got in public. She knew the risk of falling in love with him, and fell anyway. Her parents hadn't taken it well. At dinner one night, her mother asked, "Are you doing this just to spite us?" Ellie had replied calmly, "I'm doing it because it's love." A week later, she came home to find her bedroom emptied, her photos gone. They had disowned her, quietly and thoroughly. Ellie and David had eloped in the fall. No big wedding, no white dress. Just a courthouse, a borrowed suit, and a woman with trembling hands saying, "I choose you for better or worse." Years passed. Holidays came and went. Christmas cards stopped. Her brother once sent a letter that simply read, "You used to be smarter than this." Ellie had placed it in the fireplace without blinking, and yet, despite the silence, the bitterness, the disapproval, they built a life, a warm one, a good one, filled with Sunday pancakes, vinyl records, and friends who had become more like family than blood ever had. Now, here they were, those same relatives, gathered at her burial, still calling him that man, even in hushed tones. One aunt muttered, "I thought she'd come around eventually." But the headstone told another story. Under Ellie's name, carved in elegant cursive, was the phrase that brought the whispers to a halt. Forever his, in life and after. Silence fell. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet but hollow, like a truth that had finally taken up the space no one was brave enough to acknowledge until now. And somewhere, as the breeze stirred the petals of the flowers laid between both names, it felt like Ellie was still there, smiling, unshaken, still choosing him, even after all this time. The last of the soil had been pressed down, the priest's murmured prayer fading with the wind, when a man in a gray suit stepped forward. He wasn't part of the family. Most hadn't seen him before, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had been trusted. In his hand was a cream-colored envelope. On the front, in delicate cursive, it simply read, "For the family, to be read after I'm gone." He approached a woman standing near the back, a woman in her early 40s with Ellie's sharp cheekbones and restless eyes. Her name was Caroline, Ellie's niece, the only one who had ever sent flowers when David passed, though she never dared sign her name. The lawyer handed the letter to her. "Your aunt asked me to give this to someone who might actually read it." A few relatives turned, brows furrowed. Some rolled their eyes. One uncle scoffed under his breath. More dramatics. But Caroline tore the envelope open, her hands trembling slightly. She began to read aloud, her voice uneven at first, then steadying like a song rediscovered. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I imagine you're all surprised by where I chose to spend eternity. But you shouldn't be. I married David. In a world that tried to make me ashamed of it. I loved him in silence, yes, but I also loved him out loud every single day when I opened my eyes and saw him next to me. He wasn't my mistake. He was my miracle. You just never stayed long enough to see it." The words hovered over the cemetery like a breath caught in a chest. Caroline glanced up briefly. The rest of the family had fallen still. No one interrupted. No one dared. He gave me a life I didn't know I deserved. One where laughter lived in the kitchen, where music played late into the night. And yes, one where we struggled too. We faced words I won't repeat here. We faced doors that didn't open, hands that didn't reach out. And all the while you, my family, chose distance. You didn't just disapprove. You disappeared. But I loved you anyway. Caroline's voice cracked, and this time she didn't hide it. She continued, slower now. "There's something else you should know. Something I never said. Years ago, I fell ill. It was quiet at first. Fatigue. Weight. Lost tests. When the diagnosis came, I thought I'd keep it to myself. I didn't want pity. But the fear, it crept in. David, he was the one who caught it early. He pushed for a second opinion. He stood beside me in every waiting room. He held my hand during chemo. When I couldn't walk, he carried me. When I couldn't eat, he cooked. When I wanted to give up, he simply said, 'Not yet, I still need you.' So if you're wondering why I asked to be buried beside him, it's because I've already known heaven. It was holding his hand in a hospital bed at 3 a.m. By now, Caroline was crying openly. She folded the letter with care and looked at her family. No one said a word. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees overhead. A bird called out in the distance, as if nature itself needed to fill the silence that had swallowed them all. Ellie had lived quietly, but in death, her voice rang louder than any of theirs. And for the first time in a long time, They listened. Caroline sat on the edge of the stone bench near Ellie's grave, the folded letter still in her hands. The silence around her was thicker now, not cold but heavy, as if each person standing there was suddenly carrying more than they had a few minutes ago. Then she noticed it, tucked into the bottom of the envelope, a small photo slightly faded with age. She pulled it out slowly. It was a snapshot, black and white. A hospital room. In it, Ellie lay in a hospital bed, her eyes half open. Her face pale but peaceful. Her hand was wrapped in another, David's. He sat beside her, not looking at the camera but at her. His face a mixture of exhaustion and love so pure it almost burned through the paper. On the back of the photo, Ellie had written in careful script, "The moment I knew I'd survive, because he never left." Caroline's breath hitched. She looked. Her father, the same man who had sneered about that man all her life, was staring at the picture now. His jaw clenched, but his eyes gave him away. For the first time in decades they shimmered. Flashback. The hospital room buzzed with soft monitors. Ellie stirred under the thin blanket, tubes in her arms, an oxygen line resting across her cheeks. David hadn't left that chair for 14 hours. He hadn't eaten. He barely drank. A nurse had offered to take a picture for the records, something the doctor quietly recommended. Just in case. David nodded. Not for medical records, but for memory. For proof that love sometimes looked like this, unshaven, sleep-deprived, and holding on with both hands. When Ellie finally opened her eyes and saw him there, she whispered, "You stayed." David had just smiled. "You asked me to." What she never told anyone until the letter was what David had sacrificed for that moment. Back in the present, Caroline kept reading, her voice low and reverent. "None of you knew this, but when I was diagnosed, David took out a second mortgage on our house. He sold his vintage record collection, every last one of his father's jazz albums. He even pawned the watch I gave him on our wedding day. All so I could afford treatment in a system that didn't care who we were, only what we could pay. He never told me until after I was in remission. And when I asked him why, he said, because I couldn't lose the only person who ever chose me when no one else would." Somewhere behind the group, a cousin sniffled. Another wiped his eyes. Caroline looked up briefly, and to her astonishment, even Uncle Gerald, the gruffest of them all, was quietly staring at the grass, his face unreadable. But Ellie wasn't finished. "One more thing," the letter continued. "My father, your grandfather, once invited David to lunch alone. He offered him money to walk away from me, said I deserved a future without shame. David didn't say a word. He just stood up, left the envelope on the table, and walked straight back to me. He didn't even tell me until years later. When I asked why he never said anything, he kissed my hand and said, 'Because I didn't marry your father.'" Caroline's hands trembled now. The breeze caught a corner of the letter and fluttered it like a soft exhale. There was nothing more to read. Just the sound of the wind and the slow cracking of years of arrogance unraveling beneath the weight of truth. A man they had mocked, dismissed, and erased from their stories had quietly saved the woman they claimed to love, and walked away without ever asking for recognition. And now, even in death, Ellie had made sure they could no longer pretend otherwise. The family stood still, and for the first time David, who they had never truly seen, stood tall in their memories. The sun had begun to shift westward, casting long golden shadows over the cemetery. The funeral had ended, the last murmurs of the pastor's closing words still echoing softly between the trees. One by one, the cars pulled away, engines humming, like hesitant goodbyes, tires crunching over gravel. Ellie's family moved in clusters. Conversations were hushed, eyes cast downward. No one dared speak of the letter. No one dared speak of David. But the silence was different now. It wasn't loaded with judgment. It wasn't laced with bitterness. It was weight. Truth had settled in. And truth, when finally spoken aloud, never goes unnoticed. Caroline stood back, her coat wrapped tightly around her, unmoving as the last car disappeared around the bend. She remained alone by the headstone. The wind played with her hair, but she didn't flinch. She stared at the grave, the shared one. 2 names carved in the same font, aligned perfectly: Eleanor Marie Whitmore, 1943, 2023, David Elijah Whitmore, 1940, 1998, forever his in life and after. Caroline had heard those words read earlier, but only now did she feel them. She kneeled slowly, careful not to muddy her dress. From her coat pocket, she pulled a photograph, a small, worn Polaroid. The edges were curled, the colors faded. But the moment in the picture, timeless. Ellie and David, maybe in their early 30s, standing on the front porch of a house that no longer stood. Ellie's head thrown back in laughter, David looking at her like she held every answer he ever needed. Their hands were linked, not posed, just natural. Caroline had found the photo in a box of Christmas cards Ellie had sent over the years. Tucked in, but never mailed. She stared at it for a long moment, then reached forward and placed it gently at the base of the stone. The grass around it barely rustled. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and whispered, "You were right." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be, because in that single whisper, years of denial cracked just a little. Not shattered, not healed, but opened, enough for air to get in. Caroline stood again, brushing the dirt from her knees. Her eyes lingered on the stone one more time. She looked at both names, not as a mistake, not as an act of rebellion, but as what it truly was, a love story no one else could rewrite. As she turned to leave, a small breeze kicked up, lifting the corner of the photograph and carrying with it the faintest scent of wild roses from Ellie's bouquet. And in that quiet cemetery, beneath a tree heavy with blossoms, 2 souls rested, together still. Not because anyone allowed it, but because love had never asked for permission. They said her husband was a mistake. They whispered it at holidays they stopped inviting her to. They wrote it between the lines of birthday cards that never came. They painted it in the silence that grew thicker with every passing year. But Eleanor never flinched. She didn't argue with their disapproval. She didn't beg for acceptance. She just loved quietly, powerfully, without apology. And in the end, she didn't ask to be remembered by the people who never really saw her. She asked to be remembered by the man who always did. She asked to be buried in the truth. The truth that love isn't always neat. That family doesn't always mean support. That loyalty isn't always returned, but is always worth giving. The truth that David wasn't her mistake. He was her miracle. The cemetery now rests in stillness, the air heavy with stories unspoken but deeply felt. Birds chatter in the branches above, and sunlight filters through the leaves, falling gently over 2 matching headstones. The grass between them has already begun to connect. And beneath both names, Eleanor Marie Whitmore and David Elijah Whitmore, a single inscription curves across the base of stone, etched not just in granite, but in the life they lived together. No regrets, just love. Because in the end, love doesn't ask for permission. It just asks to be remembered.